In this video, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the best vintage clothing items to resell.
Hey, I'm Lee Meyer, and I'm the founder of Listing of Freedom and the Empowered Reseller. And I help clothing resellers make more money without hustling harder. Let's get started.
All right, so vintage clothing items are some of the best things to sell because they usually have a very high sale price. I do have another vintage clothing video that is very popular, and I'm going to leave the link up here for you so you can be sure to watch that as well if you haven't already. As a reseller and as a clothing reseller, I'm sure that you're always looking for ways to be able to boost your profits and boost your average sale price. And getting into the vintage clothing niche is one of the best ways to do that. It's one of the best ways to see your money add up faster from reselling. Vintage clothes have been a big part of my success in being able to make over $100,000 from flipping used clothing items on sites like eBay, Poshmark, and Mercari. And in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the best vintage items to sell. So let's get started. Oh, and before I forget, be sure to grab my free brands list where I detail all of the brands that I source and sell on a regular basis, the brands that have led me to break that $100,000 mark. There's 150 brands on the list. You'll find a link to get that free resource in the description below this video, and I'll send it to you right away. All right, so the first item that I want to talk about as far as vintage, you may have heard of the brand that's called Cool. It's an outdoor wear, active wear brand for men and women. It's spelled K-U-H-L. And back in the day, it used to be called ALF. This is what that ALF tag looks like, and it looks very similar to the new Cool tag that their tagline is Born in the Mountains, and I believe they have a mountain on the tag. ALF has a similar look to that tag with the mountain. This is an ALF jacket that sold for $65, and just like this seller has done, you probably will also want to put Cool in the title so that people who may not know what the name used to be can still find these items. And this is another pullover sweater that sold for $68 plus shipping. Next up are selvage jeans. Now you may have heard this term before, selvage. If you don't know what it means, it's basically how the edge of a garment is finished. And this is what it looks like on a pair of jeans. So if you were to roll up the pants, that seam that is down the leg will look like this, and it's self-finished. So it won't unravel. It doesn't need any extra finishing work. And while this style of hem is still around, it does tend to be more common among vintage items. Levi's is one of the most common brands that you'll find with this selvage finish. And this is a pair of jeans that sold for $150. Now you're gonna come across a lot of Levi's if you were to look through solds and look for Levi's selvage. You're gonna see a lot of listings that are gonna say non-selvage. So that's just something to be aware of when you're researching this type of item. All right, so I have a ton more vintage items and vintage brands lined up to share with you in this video, but if you're going, hey, I wanna jump in, I wanna break into this lucrative vintage clothing niche right now, I'd like to invite you to check out my vintage clothing guide where I break down all of the items to be looking for when you're outsourcing, the items that are going to sell quickly and sell for the most money and help you be able to make bigger profits and help you be able to see your profits add up faster. All right, so next up is vintage Pendleton. Now this is one where you want to be really careful with the type of item that you're selling. It's not just going to be all vintage Pendleton items are great. If you compare women's versus men's are going to sell for substantially more. Yes, there's a few women's items that will sell for a decent amount, but there are items that are selling for just a couple of dollars, which is probably not what you want. So when in doubt, I would suggest going with vintage men's Pendleton items. This is a men's button-up wool shirt, and this one sold for $60. They'll usually sell for somewhere in the $40 to $60 range, depending on the condition. Now you will, because these are wool, you probably will encounter items that have moth holes in them. And if you can pick them up cheaply enough for, let's say, $1, I would still suggest picking them up because you can put them on auction and they'll still sell for $20 to $30, even with moth holes. Crazy. With Pendleton, you'll also want to be on the lookout for unusual designs, and a lot of these designs have a tribal or southwestern look to them. This is a jacket that sold for $102 with this tribal design. You'll also notice that they use the keywords Western, Native, Aztec, and Eagle. They probably equally could have used Phoenix. Next up is a vintage brand called Martha's Miniatures, and they make girls' dresses, a lot of them with a full circle skirt style. So what that means is if you were to lay them out on the floor, it would make a whole complete circle without being like tight or not laying flat. This is what the tag looks like. Now, I pretty much pick up any and all vintage little girls' dresses that I come across, but I want to highlight this particular brand, Martha's Miniatures, and here are some sales from this brand. This is a dress that sold for $75. That is for maybe an older girl. There's another baby girl dress that sold for $75. And then there's this dress that sold for almost $150. And again, I like to pick up pretty much every brand I find. One of the ones that I come across most often is just Sears. It's not really a store that kind of exists a whole lot anymore, or at least not as big as it used to. But even Sears brand vintage dresses are selling for around $20. So not the $150, but $20 is good enough for me if I'm able to pick up the item for, 50 cents or $1. Another item to be on the lookout for are vintage Letterman's jackets. Now these can be the traditional like high school Letterman's jackets, like this one that sold for $85 or this one that sold for $127. With these, you're gonna wanna look for brands for items that are made in the USA and that are wool. I'd also keep my eye out for what might more accurately be called a varsity jacket or a bomber jacket that has kind of a varsity look to it. Some of these are gonna use the keyword Letterman's, like this Disney jacket that sold for $120. But don't overlook more basic brands like this Arizona jean jacket that I picked up in the varsity style, and I listed this on Poshmark and it sold for $55. Next up are granny squares, and these are back in a big way. If you don't know what granny squares are, they are a crochet pattern that makes a square, and you put these squares together to make bigger items like blankets. This trend is showing up in current fashions and mainstream brands, but like with most vintage, if you can get the real thing from your grandma's attic or a garage sale or wherever you happen to come across it, those original items are going to be worth more. This is a sweater that sold for $76.99 on auction with 15 bids. And what this tells me is that there is a lot of demand for this item. It wasn't just a random person who happened to come across this and pay a lot of money. There were a lot of people who wanted it and bid that price up to over $75. This is another similar sweater that sold on fixed price for $75 plus shipping. You're also gonna wanna be on the lookout for granny squares in blankets, of course, as well as scarves and purses. And don't overlook the individual granny squares themselves. Maybe if you have a relative who started a project and didn't finish, those individual squares are worth something and people are buying them in lots. All right, so next up are vintage trucker hats. Now these are really gonna depend on the style and what it is on the hat, and maybe even the brand or the company that's represented on the hat. This is a Jeep hat that sold for $60, and this is a vintage Goodyear hat that sold for $55. I'd also keep my eye out for any hats that are humorous or might appeal to a certain type of person. Otherwise, you're probably better off grouping these hats together in a lot and selling a bunch of them at once, such as this lot of 50 plus hats that sold for $122 on auction. Another item that you're gonna wanna look for, we're gonna call this clothing because it's a clothing related category more in an accessory, and that is a vintage Coach purse. And so you might, you know the Coach brand, like that is a big brand, but I do find that a lot of resellers, when they're outsourcing, that they're missing these vintage Coach purses that are just kind of a solid plain leather. They're usually either black or brown, and they'll have a little turnkey latch or lock on the front of them. And these style of just kind of basic Coach purses that a lot of resellers are passing over. These purses, depending on the condition, can sell anywhere from $40 to $100+. This is a black bag in this style that sold for $52 after getting bid up quite a lot on auction. And then this is a brown turnkey bag that sold for $127. In my personal experience, it does seem like brown or tan colors sell better than black. All right, so this is one of my favorite vintage trends, probably because I had styles like these, back in the day. And these are Y2K era fur trim coats, also known as penny lane coats. This is a Wilson's leather coat in this style that sold for $76. This is a Lane Bryant coat that sold for $110. And this is an Exhilaration, AKA a Target brand, that sold for $140 after best offer. And if you're wondering how much I know this sold for best offer, for the amount that it sold for, I do have a video where I explain how to look it up. I'm gonna leave the link up here for you so that you can look up any price that an item sold for, even when a best offer was accepted. Thanks for watching, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments about any vintage items that you've found and sold for a lot of money. Feel free to share below so we can all celebrate together. See you in the next video soon.